Outlawry was more than being a criminal. It was a formal legal status. In the medieval world, the law was a form of protection. It was a shield that stood between you and everyone else. It said you had a right to your property, your family, and your own life. The law gave you standing in your community. You were a member of society. Outlawry took that shield away completely. When a person was declared an outlaw, they were pushed outside of the law. They were no longer a person in the eyes of the court. They were an animal, a wolf. The old English term for an outlaw was wolf's head. This wasn't just a metaphor. It meant the person was to be hunted like a wolf. Anyone who found an outlaw could kill them, and they would face no legal penalty for doing so. In fact, they might even be rewarded. This was a kind of civil death. The outlaw's life as a member of society was over. Their property was forfeit. Everything they owned was seized by the crown or their local lord. Their wife was considered a widow. Their children were considered orphans. Any legal contracts they had were void. They could not sue someone in court. They could not inherit land. They could not give testimony. They had no rights at all. Their existence was erased from the legal world. This seems incredibly harsh to us now. We think of justice as involving a trial, a defense, and a specific punishment for a specific crime. Outlawry was different. It wasn't really a punishment for a crime, it was a punishment for contempt of court. It was a tool the legal system used when it couldn't get its hands on someone. Imagine a man is accused of murder. The sheriff is sent to bring him to court, but the man runs away. He hides in the forest or flees to another part of the country. The court can't hold a trial without the accused, so what does it do? The system can't just let him get away with it. That would undermine the king's authority and the entire concept of law and order. So the court began the process of outlawry. It was the system's way of saying, if you will not come to the law, then the law will not protect you. It was a powerful threat. It turned the entire country against the fugitive. There was nowhere safe to go. Every man's hand was turned against you. Your friends and family were forbidden from helping you. Giving an outlaw food, shelter, or any kind of aid was a serious crime in itself. It made the helper an accomplice. So the outlaw was truly alone. They were stripped of their name, their property, their legal identity, and their social connections. They were a ghost while still alive. Their only value was the price on their head. This wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about enforcing the power of the court and the king. It was a tool for a state that didn't have a police force. The government couldn't send out officers to track down every fugitive. Instead, it outsourced the job to the entire population. It made every citizen a potential bounty hunter. There were degrees of this. Not all outlaws were declared a wolf's head. That was usually reserved for men who committed serious felonies. A woman who was outlawed was said to be waived. The principle was the same. She lost all legal protection. A person outlawed for a lesser crime, like a large debt, might not be subject to being killed on sight, but they still lost all their property and rights. Their life was ruined either way. The core idea was simple. To live in medieval society, you had to be part of the community and subject to its laws. By refusing to answer a court summons, a person was breaking that fundamental social contract. They were saying they were above the law. The law's response was to place them completely beneath it. It was a brutal but effective way for a government with limited resources to maintain control. It made fleeing from justice one of the most dangerous decisions a person could make. Becoming an outlaw wasn't an overnight event. It was a formal, public process. The law had to be seen to be followed, even when casting someone out from its protection. The system was designed to give the accused every chance to appear and face justice. It was their refusal that triggered the final declaration. It all started with an accusation. Someone might be accused of a felony, like robbery, murder, or treason. Or they might be accused of a lesser crime, but fail to pay a fine. The process could be set in motion for many reasons. Once the accusation was made, the local court, usually the county court, which met regularly, would issue a summons. The sheriff was responsible for delivering this summons and ensuring the accused person showed up on their court date. But what if they didn't? This is where the machinery of outlawry began to turn. The failure to appear was called contumacy. It was a deep insult to the court's authority. At the next session of the county court, the accused would be publicly called again. The sheriff would announce their name, demanding they appear to answer the charges. This was done out in the open for all to hear. The community was a witness to the process. If the person still did not appear, the process was repeated. They would be called at a second court, then a third, and then a fourth. These consecutive callings were a form of legal pressure. Word would spread. The fugitive would know they were being sought. Their family would know. Their neighbors would know. They had multiple opportunities to turn themselves in. The law was, in a way, being patient. After the fourth calling, if the accused was still a no-show, the final step was taken at the Fifth County Court. Here, the court would formally declare them an outlaw. This was a solemn and serious moment. The judgment was pronounced. From that second forward, the person lost all legal rights. The sheriff would be ordered to seize all their lands and possessions on behalf of the crown. The declaration would be recorded. For very serious crimes, the process could be faster. And the church had its own version called excommunication, which had a similar effect on a person's spiritual life. But the civil process of outlawry was about breaking the person's bond with the secular world and its laws. Why would someone risk this? Why not just show up to court? There were many reasons. The most obvious one is that they were guilty. They knew they would likely be convicted and hanged, so they decided to take their chances on the run. Fleeing was a desperate gamble, but for a guilty person, it might have felt like the only one they had. But innocent people might flee too. The medieval justice system was not always fair. A poor farmer accused by a powerful lord stood little chance of a fair hearing. Witnesses could be bribed or intimidated. Evidence was often flimsy. The trial itself could be an ordeal, sometimes literally. An innocent person might believe, rightly or wrongly, that they would be condemned no matter what. Faced with a corrupt sheriff or a biased court, running might have seemed safer than staying. Sometimes people just fell through the cracks. A person might not even know they had been summoned. They might have been traveling or living in a remote area. It was their responsibility to know what was happening at the local court, but it wasn't a perfect system. A summons might go astray. A name might be mistaken, but ignorance was not an excuse. Once the process was complete, the person was an outlaw, whether they knew it or not. The system also had a feature called the hue and cry. If a crime was witnessed, anyone who saw it was expected to shout and raise the alarm. Everyone in earshot was then legally obligated to stop what they were doing and chase the suspect. To ignore the hue and cry was a crime itself. This was community policing at its most basic level. If the suspect got away, the hue and cry was the first step in a process that could end with them being declared an outlaw. It was a system that involved the entire community in law enforcement. It had to because there was no one else to do it. The declaration of outlawry was the final terrible weapon in that community-based arsenal of justice. The stories paint a romantic picture of the outlaw's life. They picture a merry band of men in a sun-dappled forest, free from the worries of the world. They feast on the king's deer, share their loot, and laugh in the face of authority. Robin Hood is the great example of this. His life in Sherwood Forest seems like a permanent adventure. The reality was almost certainly the opposite. The life of a real medieval outlaw was likely short, brutal, and filled with misery and fear. It was a life of constant survival, not a life of merry adventure. The Greenwood was not a paradise. It was a cold, damp, and dangerous place. The first and most pressing problem was food. An outlaw could not simply walk into a village market and buy a loaf of bread. They would be recognized and captured, or killed. They had to get food by other means. Poaching was one option. They could hunt deer or other game in the great forests. But this was risky. The forests were patrolled by foresters who worked for the king or local lords. Getting caught meant a swift and brutal punishment, and hunting required skill and luck. An outlaw couldn't count on a successful hunt every day, so they often resorted to theft. They would steal from travelers on the road, raid isolated farms for livestock, or sneak into villages at night to take what they could. This made them criminals in fact, not just in legal theory. It also made them hated and feared by the very common people that the Robin Hood legends claimed they protected. A poor farmer whose only pig was stolen by outlaws would not see them as heroes. He would see them as dangerous men who had made his own difficult life even harder. Shelter was another constant struggle. In summer, an outlaw might be able to sleep outdoors. But in the cold, wet winters of England, that was a death sentence. They needed to find caves, makeshift huts, or other hidden places to survive. They were exposed to the elements. Sickness and disease must have been rampant. A simple infection from a cut, a fever, or a broken bone could be fatal. There was no doctor to call, no one to care for them, and then there was the fear. An outlaw lived every moment looking over his shoulder. Any stranger could be a bounty hunter. Any noise in the woods could be the sheriff's men. They could trust no one. Their old friends and family were legally forbidden from helping them. To do so would put their own lives and property at risk. This isolation was a heavy psychological burden. This is why outlaws often formed bands. It wasn't for camaraderie and adventure. It was for survival. A group of men was safer than a lone individual. They could watch out for each other. They could work together to hunt or to rob people. There was safety in numbers, but even these bands were likely rife with paranoia and mistrust. The price on an outlaw's head was a powerful temptation. Any member of the band could betray his companions for a pardon and a reward. These were not bands of merry men, they were desperate alliances of desperate people. The leader of such a band would have to be ruthless. He would need to rule through fear and strength to keep his men in line. The romantic idea of a noble, charismatic leader like Robin Hood is probably a fantasy. The real leaders were more likely to be violent and pragmatic men, skilled in fighting and intimidation. The outlaws' world was small and shrinking. They were tied to the woods and wild places, the margins of society. They could not enter towns or cities, they could not participate in festivals or go to church. They were cut off from everything that made life normal. Their existence was a grim cycle of finding food, staying warm, and avoiding capture. It was a life of desperation. The freedom of the outlaw was the freedom of a hunted animal, a freedom that could end at any moment with an arrow or a blade. It was not a life anyone would choose. It was a life that was forced upon them by circumstance and the harshness of the law. While the life of a real outlaw was grim, the idea of the outlaw was something else entirely. In the stories and songs of medieval people, the outlaw was often a hero. He was a symbol of freedom and a champion of the common man. This gap between the harsh reality and the popular image is where things get interesting. It tells us a lot about the hopes and frustrations of ordinary people. The most famous outlaw story, of course, is that of Robin Hood. The earliest ballads about him don't portray him as a nobleman who steals from the rich to give to the poor. He is a yeoman, a man of the common people, and he is violent. He fights and kills the corrupt sheriff of Nottingham and his men. He is a rebel who lives by his own rules in the greenwood. Why was this character so popular? Because he represented a fantasy of justice. For a peasant living under a harsh lord or a corrupt official, life was often unfair. The law did not always protect them. It was often a tool used by the rich and powerful to oppress the poor. The sheriff, in reality, was a tax collector and an enforcer for the king. He was not always a popular figure. So a story about a man who defies the sheriff, who lives freely outside the system of oppression, was incredibly appealing. Robin Hood didn't just break the law, he punished those who abused the law. He turned the world upside down. In his forest, the weak were protected and the powerful were humbled. This was wish fulfillment. It was a way for people to imagine a world where justice prevailed, even if it had to come from an outlaw living in the woods. This idea of the social bandit is a powerful one. The social bandit is a criminal in the eyes of the authorities, but he is a hero to his own people. He rights wrongs and fights for the oppressed. Whether a figure like Robin Hood ever truly existed is not the point. The point is that people wanted to believe he did. They told and retold his stories for centuries. And there were real historical figures who were turned into legends like this. After the Norman conquest in 1066, many Anglo-Saxons resisted the new French-speaking rulers. One of these figures was Hereward the Wake. He led a rebellion against William the Conqueror from the marshy fens of eastern England. He was eventually defeated, but stories about his heroic deeds and clever tricks circulated for a long time. He became an outlaw symbol of English resistance to foreign rule. Another real person was Fulk Fitzwarren, a Norman nobleman who was deprived of his ancestral castle by King John. For years, Fulk lived as an outlaw, fighting a private war against the king. He was eventually pardoned. His story was written down as a sprawling family romance, full of adventure, disguises, and daring escapes. He was a real outlaw, but his life was transformed into a heroic tale. These stories served a purpose. They were a form of social commentary. They allowed people to criticize the powerful without doing so directly. You couldn't say the sheriff is a thief, but you could sing a song about Robin Hood tricking and robbing a greedy sheriff. It was a safe way to express discontent. The stories also reinforced a certain moral code. The outlaw hero, like Robin Hood, often had his own code of honor. He might be a thief, but he was loyal to his men. He was pious, often showing devotion to the Virgin Mary. He protected women and the poor. He only targeted the rich and corrupt, especially greedy churchmen and government officials. This made his crimes acceptable to the audience. He wasn't just a lawbreaker, he was a different kind of lawmaker, enforcing a more natural, moral law in a world where the official law had gone wrong. So, the outlaw existed in two forms. There was the real desperate man, hunted and hiding in the woods. And there was the legendary hero, a figure of fantasy and resistance. The real outlaw was a problem for the authorities to solve. The fictional outlaw was a solution for the common people, a hero who gave them hope in an often unjust world. Every outlaw's story had to end. This could happen in a few different ways. The most common and brutal end was capture or death. The life of a fugitive was incredibly dangerous. A confrontation with the sheriff's men, a fight with a bounty hunter, or a betrayal by one of his own companions could lead to a swift and violent death. If an outlaw was captured alive, his fate was sealed. Because he was already an outlaw, he had no right to a trial. His guilt was legally assumed. He had already been condemned by his failure to appear in court. So there was no need for a jury or a judge. He could be and often was taken to the nearest gallows and hanged without any further legal process. Yes, it was a summary execution. The goal was to make a public example of him, to show everyone the price of defying the law. But there was another way out. It was a narrow and difficult path, but it was possible. An outlaw could seek a pardon. The king had the power to forgive any crime and to reverse a declaration of outlawry. A pardon would restore the person's legal rights. They could come out of the forest, reclaim their place in society, and live as a free person again. Their civil death would be reversed. Getting a pardon was not easy. It wasn't usually about the king deciding someone was truly sorry. It was a practical matter, often involving politics and money. An outlaw might need a powerful friend to intercede for him. A wealthy lord or a bishop might speak to the king on the outlaw's behalf, perhaps in exchange for a service or a payment. Sometimes a pardon could be bought directly. The king's government was always in need of money. An outlaw with wealthy family or hidden resources could negotiate a large fine in exchange for having his legal status restored. Injustice could be a financial transaction. Another way to get a pardon was to prove useful to the king. The kings were often fighting wars. They needed skilled soldiers, especially archers. The kind of man who could survive as an outlaw in the woods was often an expert with a bow. Kings would sometimes offer a general pardon to outlaws who agreed to serve in their armies. Edward I did this for his wars in Scotland and France. For an outlaw, this was a tempting offer. A chance to fight and earn a legitimate place in the world was far better than a life of hiding and theft. It was a way to turn their illicit skills to the king's advantage. As for the system of outlawry itself, it began to fade over time. It was a legal tool that belonged to a specific kind of society. It worked when the central government was relatively weak and relied on the community to enforce its laws. As medieval kingdoms grew into more modern states, the justice system became more sophisticated. Governments developed better ways to keep records. They created more professional law enforcement bodies. The courts became more organized and their reach extended more reliably across the country. The state was better able to find and arrest accused criminals. It no longer needed to rely on the blunt instrument of declaring someone a wolf's head and outsourcing justice to the general public. New legal ideas also came into play. The idea that everyone, no matter the accusation, had a right to a trial began to take hold. The punishments became more standardized. Instead of a blanket civil death, the law focused more on specific punishments for specific crimes, like imprisonment, fines, or execution after a proper trial. Outlawry did not disappear overnight. It continued in some form for centuries, but its importance declined. It became a more obscure legal procedure rather than a central pillar of the justice system. By the modern era, it was effectively gone, replaced by concepts like arrest warrants and extradition. The end of outlawry marked a shift in the relationship between the individual and the state. The state became strong enough to prosecute people directly without having to cast them out of society entirely. The wild places of the world shrank, and the reach of the law grew. The age of the outlaw, the man who lived in the green wood beyond the king's authority, slowly came to a close. His brutal reality was forgotten, but his powerful legend lived on.